When you're working with Premiere Pro, you will be using visual assets from several cameras and sources. These assets most likely will come in a variety of sizes and resolutions that aren't immediately obvious to the eye when you look at them on your computer, but they can cause problems for you when you import them into Premiere. When you create a new project or sequence in Premiere Pro, the default resolution is 1920 by 1080 pixels with a 16:9 widescreen aspect ratio. This is what is known as 1080p Full HD. Let us take a look at how a few common photo and video formats compare in terms of resolution. As you can see, photos and videos that may look the same size when viewed on the computer screen can be dramatically different in terms of size and resolution. To show you what can happen when you work with assets of different resolutions, I'm going to place a photo that I want to use as the title for a new project on the timeline. By doing this, I create a new sequence of height, width, and resolution equal to the image I just placed. When I place my A-roll onto the timeline, see what happens. My video footage is in 1080p HD, which is much smaller than the 24 megapixel photo that I placed first. To resolve this, we can use effect controls in the Program Monitor pane in the editing workspace. Except that in this particular case, we can't do that because we would have to upscale the video in order to make it fit, and that would introduce pixelation, which is something we never want. As a rule of thumb, you can always downscale assets with no problem, but never upscale unless you absolutely have no other choice, and even then you can only go so far before the quality starts to drop beneath acceptable levels. What I like to do is to place an asset that I know has the correct resolution for my project, 1080p, onto the timeline first. That way the sequence gets formatted correctly right away. Now I can move the footage out of the way and drop my title onto the timeline. As expected, it is going to be much too large to fit the frame, but that is no problem because we can easily scale it down using Premiere Pro's effect controls. If I click on the photo on the timeline to select the item and I come over to the source monitor on the left and click on the Effect Controls tab, a list of available properties for this particular clip appears. I can now locate the Scale control and drag it to the left to scale the image down or to the right to scale it up. I can also type a new value directly into the control setting if I want to. One important thing to note about effect controls is that you must have the playhead positioned above the clip you are working on in order to see your changes update in real time in the Program Monitor. If the playhead is sitting somewhere else, you could be making changes, but not seeing anything in the Program Monitor and then asking yourself, I'm doing something, but it doesn't work. So be sure to 1. Click on the clip you want to edit, and 2. Place the playhead directly above it so you can see your changes update in real time in the Program Monitor. Now that you know about media formats and resolutions and how they manifest themselves inside of Premiere Pro, let's talk about how to set up your camera. For the purposes of these class projects, I recommend shooting your video in 1080p at 30 frames per second. You may have heard that 24 frames per second gives a more cinematic look due to the lower frame rate's introduction of more motion blur. If that is what you prefer, by all means, go for it. Most camera settings, including mobile phones, can shoot in 1080p at 30 frames per second. So check the camera settings on your camera or phone to get it dialed in. Alternatively, if you have a camera that supports it, you could shoot in 60 frames per second instead for even greater clarity. But what's going to happen is you're doubling your file size for very little gain, since you're now using twice the number of frames to capture the footage. Many cameras allow you to shoot in even higher frame rates, such as 120 or 240 frames per second. This will produce ultra-sharp footage that can be slowed down in post-production to create slow-motion sequences that can be used to great effect in many projects. So what about 4K video? Why not shoot in 4K? Well, you can if you want to, but for these projects I consider it to be overkill. When your target platform is YouTube and Behance, many, if not most people, won't be on fast enough connections to be able to see your 4K content. It will be streamed to them in HD or even SD versions instead. Secondly, 4K video produces much larger files that take up more space on your hard drive. They do require faster computer hardware as well to process it in Premiere. And last but not least, they will take up much more space and take longer to upload if you don't have a really fast internet connection.